Hi, in this video we are going to explore strategy from a systems thinking perspective. And that's because strategy is a really critical part of advocacy work. It's where our dreams meet reality. But first I would like to recap on some basics so that we're all on the same page. From an advocacy or campaigning point of view, strategy is about resources. It's about building and using what you have, including the power that you build with others, and then using these resources to get what you need. And in advocacy, that means building power with others to influence and create change in the systems you're working with. And that could be to influence others who have power over decisions or even resources that impact you. And this is all to then achieve our goal or the change that we would like to see in the world. And then, of course, we use this power and influence that we have built and the knowledge and experience to influence the system and create change, and so on. Strategy and tactics are often confused, and it's because we tend to jump straight into tactics. Our brain really loves that certainty, and we can often get excited about tactics before we've given strategy proper consideration. So it's always useful to make sure that you and your team are on the same page when it comes to the difference between strategy and tactics and where you are in your planning. And so strategy you could think of as the general route or direction that we take to achieve our goals. And tactics are the many things that we do along the way, like community events, research reports, media interviews, protests. And so, for example, if your goal was to climb this mountain range, the route that you've chosen would be your strategy. And the tactics might include how many stops you take along the way to acclimatize, or what mental activities you use to keep going, or whether you even hire a Sherpa to carry all of your belongings. The other thing that's often confused is the difference between goals and objectives. And if we use the mountain analogy again, the goal is getting to the summit, and the objectives are all the kind of important milestones along the way. And so getting to a pass between mountains or reaching a smaller peak. And so the important thing from a systems perspective is that your goal remains constant. This describes your ambition and the change you want to see in the world. However, your objectives may change along the way. And even your strategy might need to be adapted along the way. Right? You are constantly learning about the system you're working within. And that system is always changing. There are always people making new decisions. And so that system is dynamic and constantly changing. So you may start out with a specific objective or strategy in order to get to your goal. But along the way, you might discover some changes in the system, or you might discover that your current approach isn't working, or you might find another option. And so if we use that mountain metaphor, you might get to a planned part in your route and discover that there's been a rock slide that's blocked your path. So you need to find another way. So when we're approaching change from a systems perspective, we need to be open to changing objectives along our pathway to change. And so the goal and maybe the general direction doesn't change, but our strategy and our objectives may need to change depending on the external circumstances. And this is because we're trying to figure out where to focus in a system to create that change, and that's all about experimenting with different types of leverage points. When we come from a systems perspective at this, it's generally not about a specific target that we might often think of, like a specific person or in politics or business or a specific company or organization. Instead, it might be about the shift in the relationships between these different actors in the system. So the relationship between an institution and citizens, or some sort of change in the processes or rules that determine how people collaborate, or even a change in social norms and the habits that we're trying to, in order to change a certain belief, right? So you want to focus on the relationships in the system that are most likely to have these far-reaching impacts to transform the entire system, rather than just the parts of it. Dr. Orit Gal is a professor specializing in the practical application of complexity theory, and she has a great way describing intervening in these types of systems, and she describes it as social acupuncture. And so this is based on the ancient Chinese technique of acupuncture, where you use needles on specific parts of the body to create a change that can affect the whole body system, like such as alleviating headaches or insomnia, or even easing digestion. And so, like the human body, the systems we are dealing with are made up of many different interconnected elements. And so, there are many in a system, there are many individuals interacting and making decisions based on the local context and opportunities or conflict. And all these elements are working together to form the whole of the system, which is constantly changing. And so, working with leverage points is similar to using these acupuncture needles, where we're trying to find these kind of highly sensitive places in the system where there might be vulnerabilities or that are connected to many other parts of the system, so that small changes could bring about large shifts in system behavior. So intervening in these small points could actually have far-reaching impacts across the system. And we can either strengthen the responses in the system, or we can disrupt them in order to change the flow of ideas or resources, behavior, and even skills and people through the system. There are different types of these leverage points. And so another way to look at them is to go back to our iceberg model, and these different types of intervention points can relate to different levels in the iceberg. And so at that level of events, if our work is focused on responding to current events and, are taking some immediate action, our strategy could be described as quite reactionary. So while we might be addressing some urgent symptoms, and that's important to, ease pain and harm in the system, but if we don't look beyond those kind of immediate events, we may not be addressing any of the underlying causes in the system. And then if we look at the patterns and trends part of the system, we can start to anticipate some of the system behavior, and we might even be able to predict how the system will respond in certain circumstances. And if we're really lucky, we might be able to mitigate some of the worst and potential of the potential problems in the system. But again, this doesn't necessarily address the root causes of the problems. It's only once we start to look at the structures in the system, so those kind of dominant political, economic, and social institutions, that we start to see the ability to redesign parts of the system. And so, this is often where our work in advocacy can focus, right, in terms of targeting laws and policy change, or even kind of public authorities and corporations, those who have power over parts of the system and help to shape how the system works. And it's at this level that we can begin to redesign parts of the system and address some of those structural inequalities and the root causes of the problem. But institutions are often resist change, and they're really good at self-stabilizing and adapting when they're being pushed to change. So while changes at this part of the system and intervening in leverage points here are really necessary, if we only focus here, we might not be able to create the kind of long-term transformational change in the system that you want to see. And so there's also leverage points at this kind of deeper level of the iceberg that's about where the dominant worldviews sit, right, including narratives and underlying beliefs and values and social norms. And we've already looked at this quite a bit when we looked at using narrative strategy as a way to kind of create change at this mental modes level. And so by working in this part of the system, we can start to shift some of those mental modes and beliefs and mindsets that really shape the system and can have this kind of real transformative effect. And there's another strategic approach to change in system that reaches across all these levels, and we describe these as emerging alternatives. This is where innovators experiment with ideas and the seeds of new systems, and most often these solutions are already there in the systems and at the margins. And these solutions are essential if we want to create change and systems transformation, because as the current system is breaking down, something new needs to replace it, and we have to plant the seeds now of these alternatives if we want to support them to grow and fill this gap. Systems have different characteristics, and the way that we approach strategy and creating change in systems also depends on the type of systems we're working within. Dave Snowden, who is the founder of Cognitive Edge and a leader in the field of understanding and managing complexity, created the Cynefin framework in order to help us to understand how different types of systems require different approaches. So let's start with simple systems. These are the ones where the system's really highly ordered and predictable, and there's already an established best practice. Right? So there's one solution for the situation you're in. For example, you might be submitting a receipt or an invoice to get paid. So when it arrives, you can clearly see it's an invoice and you know what the procedure is for sign off and how to submit it. And you can be pretty confident that you'll get the response you need from the system, like getting your invoice paid. So this is considered best practice because there is one solution, and that's this process that you need to follow. And if you don't follow that, you might not get the response that you're looking for. Then we have complicated systems, and these are ones where the solution isn't immediately obvious, and there's more than one solution. But with some expert knowledge, you can arrive at an appropriate solution. So, for example, you might need to implement a new IT system in your organization. And there are many different options out there, but by gathering the requirements from all of your staff and other users, and then analyzing those needs against the different options that are available, you can make a decision. You can make a decision about the solution that's best for you. And then we have complex systems. And so anytime I think we're dealing with the interconnection of social, political, and economic systems like inequality or social conflict, or then we're dealing with highly complex systems that are also dynamic, right? So they're adapting based on the current context and they're constantly changing. And in these types of systems, it's impossible to know every part of the system and be able to predict how it will behave. So, in fact, the solution is usually only obvious in hindsight. So after you've achieved something and you look back on it, then, it's obvious what was going on there and what the solution was. And so in complex systems, we really need to take a different approach to creating solutions and this is called emergent practice because there are many different solutions and we don't know what is the right one from the beginning. So it needs to be much more experimental. And it means experimenting with these different types of leverage points, assessing how the system responds, and then deciding if it's working and you carry on and scale the work that you're doing, or if it's not working and you need to adapt in some way and try and create change in the system through a different type of leverage point. So if you've ever felt paralyzed to make a decision and the solution wasn't clear, it's likely because you're dealing with a complex system. And often this can actually, lead to analysis paralysis in our organizations, and we feel like we're going around and round in circles and trying to find the right answer. But that's because we're often treating a complex system like it's complicated, and that, we think that if we can just kind of get the right information and analyze it, we'll come up with a good solution. When in fact, we're working in a complex system, and it's really only with hindsight that we can understand what the right solution was. And then we have chaotic systems. And these are ones where, there's some urgency to act. There might be a crisis, and it's a situation you've never experienced before. And so that kind of need to act quickly means that the first response is to act. And then based on the response from the system, you can evaluate that and then adapt your actions based on what you've learned. So, and this is something we've all experienced in the last few years during the pandemic. Many countries had never faced a situation like this before, but needed to take some immediate action. And then it was only after analyzing and evaluating kind of the responses in terms of infections and how many people are hospitalized and death, could countries then adapt their response in some way over time. Based on what they learned through this experience. So you can use this deck then to reflect with your team about working in complex systems, and explore how you could adapt your ways of working to approach strategy in complex systems as something that needs to be tested, evaluated, and adapted. Or you can also use the tools in the toolbox the next time that you're developing or revisiting your strategy to look at different points of intervention across structures, mental modes, and emerging alternatives. And you'll also find more resources about systems-based strategy in the tool deck. Thanks for watching.